It's great to see you all at the workshop in the history of material texts. New faces and friends and old, wherever you may be. I'm John Pollock. I'm one of the co-organizers of the seminar, and I work in the Kislak Center at the library. Somewhere on your Zoom screens are my partners in crime, Zach Lesser from English, Penn English, and Jerry Singerman from the Penn Press.
Hello, everybody.
Oh, that was very spooky, Jerry. And Philip Mogan, from sunny Houston.
Hey, everyone.
Graduate organizer. So as always, if you're not on our listserv, you darn well should be. It's just a little bit more email already, and it's better than most of the email you get. So let us know and we'll put you on there. We have still a few more weeks of talks to go this semester. Happy to report next week's speaker is Simcha Gross from Penn, taking us earlier still to talk about a Passover text. Our usual format for those of you who are new is a presentation followed by a Q&A. So once that starts, we'll open things up and we'll suggest that you use the raise hand function in the participants link at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or you can put questions in the chat and we will field them that way. So that will be our format after Lara's presentation. And it is really a delight for us to have Lara with her, and her somewhat ghoulish setting there behind her is absolutely perfect. So Lara is friend and Philadelphia colleague. She's associate professor of English at Swarthmore College, regular attendee of this seminar, of course, stalwart researcher at the library company and many other local institutions, and equally devoted teacher. That Swarthmore fully but somehow never overly committed way that they all managed to pull off over there. So I know we're all stressed out, but I just want to turn the clock back briefly a little bit, don't we all? I'm not talking about daylight saving time or something, because I want to recall, for those of you who don't know, something that happened way back in 2010. A conference that Lara and Jordan Stein, and I see Jordan there, which is awesome, put together, that was entitled Early African American Print Culture in Theory and Practice, co-sponsored by the McNeil Center for Early American Studies and the Library Company of Philadelphia. I was thinking about this because it seems to me that that event was kind of a field-defining event, a kind of a game changer in many ways. Lara and Jordan's preamble to that conference, you can actually still find it on their website. I just want to quote this for you. It reads, "The late 18th and 19th centuries mark both the inauguration of an African-American literary tradition and the consolidation of American print culture. Yet these two most vibrant areas for American studies scholarship are rarely considered in relation to one another." So in that conference and in the University of Pennsylvania Press volume that followed in 2012, entitled Early African American Print Culture, published by Jerry, Lara, Jordan, and all of their authors set out terms for a series of new inquiries. And I think it's fair to say that we are still working on those projects, on the challenges they set out for us today. In their introduction, they write that they want us to consider how print culture studies and critical race studies might fit together. That sounds like kind of a no-brainer now, but actually we have their work to thank for opening that door. And I remember attending that conference and being amazed by all of the exciting work that people were discussing together across fields of literature and history, and also by the sense that we were just at the very beginning of something, that there were miles of uncharted territory ahead. And many of the voices in that volume have been presenters at this seminar. Lara has, again, appropriately, always been interested in fakes and frauds. that great American tradition that's still with us. And that was the subject of her 2011 book, also pen press, thank you, Jerry, The Fabrication of American Literature, Fraudulence and Antebellum Print Culture. Now, more recently, as you'll hear tonight, Lara is kind of going underground in her exploration of the 19th century. So we all learned recently, thanks to a special someone, that bad things happen in Philadelphia. Now, I believe that Lara already knew this and knew that this has always been true in Philly. If it's not bad enough on the surface, just wait until you find out how messed up it is underneath that surface. So I hope you read Lara's abstract, because she's promising quite a lot for us tonight, including sex, drugs, and ritual. And she is going to introduce us to someone she calls a teacher, occultist, and sex magician. That's not an MLA job posting, although maybe it could be. Lara, thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you also to Philip and to Zach and to Jerry for all of your work organizing this. And thanks so much, everyone, for coming out on a spectacularly weird night. It is good to be in your company. I should warn you in advance that this is not a particularly, I realize, material text-ish talk. And so if people, want to bail on that account, then I will not hold it against you, but I hope you'll stick around and maybe even help me think through how it could be a more material text-oriented project. But the work I'm presenting today, as John mentioned, comes from this book project I'm working on called Going Underground, Race, Space, and the Subterranean in the 19th Century United States, which examined the emergence of the underground as a figure for being in, but not of, like a rotten world. First popularized in the metaphorical sense by viral newspaper coverage of the Underground Railroad in the 1840s, the underground offered an image of subversive activity that has remained central to our political vocabulary. So I'm interested in the long history of this kind of now familiar idea, but I'm especially interested in seeking out the versions of the underground that were kind of left behind along the way. So I focus on the early underground's relationship to two other formations in particular. Actual subterranean spaces on the one hand, and then contemporaneous racial thought on the other. So it turns out that for a surprisingly long time, the underground's emergent figurative meaning was entwined with its literal meaning as a space below the earth. So one of the things I'm interested in are the affordances of visualizing insubordination as a space that one could dwell in. And then I argue further that 19th century undergrounds were often racialized, and most often they were racialized as Black. So while the book explores various examples of the racialization of the underground, it centers on Black authors who use the underground to imagine Black life within unfreedom. And my hope is that the 19th century undergrounds that the book studies might suggest some new, which is to say old, modes of like world making and world breaking for a time when this world feels increasingly untenable. So today, I want to think with you about a set of undergrounds that hardly existed. And they sprang from the imagination of Paschal Beverly Randolph, who lived from 1825 to 1875, who was a prolific writer, a Freedmen's Bureau teacher, an occultist, and a sex magician. And then if I can work the share screen, you can get a sense of what he looked like. So this is Randolph. A mixed race man who often described himself as angular and eccentric. This was a phrase that he reused in most of his published works. Randolph struggled against anti-Black racism, which he also internalized in complicated ways, and economic precarity his whole life. But in his writing, he transformed his racialized identity from a source of earthly exclusion into a means of paranormal communion. Asserting, I owe my successes mental to my conglomerate blood, my troubles and poverty to the same source. His experiences of alienation and hyperawareness, he contended, had fostered multiple sensitivities, as he put it, while what he called his mixed identity gave him the power to channel multiple spirits in his own body. We might hear the echo, I think, of Randolph's connection between his racialization and his gifts as a medium nearly half a century later in the supernatural overtones of W.E.B. Du Bois's famous formulation of double consciousness as, quote, the peculiar sensation of being gifted with second sight in this American world. I'm also almost certain that we hear much more than the echo of Randolph's thought in the novel Of One Blood by his one-time Boston neighbor, Pauline Hopkins. As many of you probably remember, its protagonist, Royal Briggs, is like Randolph, a mixed-race medical doctor who struggles with depression and internalized racism, who communicates with his spiritually gifted dead mother, who travels to Ethiopia, and who explores the prophetic properties of magic mirrors and trance states. And if people are interested in this connection, I can say more about it in the Q&A. So the details of Randolph's particular cosmology changed from work to work. But they might be summed up by Fred Moten's statement, "Fuck a home in this world if you think you have one." If we took a properly cosmic perspective, Randolph held, we could all recognize ourselves as a drift from the here and now. So he generally believed that all beings begin as what he called monads, which are like thoughts of God that scatter over the universe as a kind of divine particulate. And then after death, human souls seek to return to their divine origins. And they travel to this vast and kind of heterogeneous system of spirit realms and arrive at a location that corresponds to their spiritual development. And Randolph's criteria for these celestial divisions varied over the course of his career. And at times he delineates them in pretty starkly racist terms. And other times, and these are sometimes even within the same text, he contends that, and I'm quoting from him now, ties, blood, race, or family count for little or nothing over there. And in his late work, he actually declares that, quote, the choice abodes of spirit land primarily belong to people of color, who, quote, outnumber the fair ones in the ratio of about 12,000 to 100, besides excelling them in the same degree in mind, love, knowledge, force of nature, and power of soul. So in this account, the spirit world offers not only an exit from white supremacy, but an eternity of redress, which gathers people of color from all over the earth to enjoy dominion beyond it. So Randolph pictured the spheres of the spirit world in elaborate detail, including their distinctive environments and their architecture and their cultural institutions. He explained that the appearance of each sphere corresponds to the spiritual development of its inhabitants because they are what he called a projection from the souls who dwell together and create their own scenery and surroundings. And Randolph means this quite literally. In the spirit worlds, he explains, each thought possesses an inherent vitality of its own, as also form, proportion, and coherence. So in short, spirit worlds are made of palpable ideas. And as such, they contain both familiar forms of animal life and entirely different ones that he explained embody some salient and positive love, principle, or affection. So I leave it up to you to imagine what those look like. Human souls look like earthly people, but instead of blood, quote, only a pure white or colorless electric current courses through them. They wear clothes and have no bad teeth or saliva. They move through space using magnetism. They have musical sounds and note values. And so the spheres in which they gather are literally harmonious and rhythmical. They have buildings, cities, schools, art, music, and, quote, more fun than we do. They also have better sex, for, quote, up there and there only can its deep mysteries be known, its keener joys be felt. Souls do get married, but these marriages do not depend on, quote, justice, parson, or priest, and they last just so long as the parties, and I'm still quoting from Randolph, as the parties thereto are agreeable and mutually pleased with and attracted to each other, and no longer. But one need not wait until death to access these extraterrestrial realms. As Randolph moved around the US, which he did throughout his whole life, kind of propelled by hardship and restlessness, he founded a series of secret societies devoted to his interpretation of Rosicrucianism. And sorry, I actually forgot to explain this, but I can say more in the Q&A about how he kind of envisioned the relationship between his thought and kind of mainstream, kind of, if you can call it mainstream, Rosicrucianism, which he sometimes identified with and sometimes didn't. So these were the Supreme Grand Lodge of the Triple Order, which was, he founded in San Francisco in 1861, the Rosicrucian Club in Boston in the late 1860s or early 1870s, the Brotherhood of Euless in Nashville in 1874, and then another incarnation of the Supreme Grand Lodge, which he now added was of the Triplicate Order, in San Francisco in late 1874. And then in addition to these in-person undergrounds, Randolph sought to construct a virtual occult underground through a sub rosa body of writing that his more widely available publications hinted at, but could not themselves contain. And let me give you a sense of these. Okay. So can you all see the excerpts now on your screens? Okay, cool. So Randolph published numerous handbooks and novels and memoirs and newspaper articles, manifestos, which all expounded his occult thought. But in these interpolated statements and footnotes and publisher advertisements, he also promoted a shadow repertoire, which included pamphlets, what he called privately printed letters, handwritten manuscripts, formulas, and correspondence disclosing secrets that, as he put it, cannot well be printed in a book. So texts like the Golden Letter, the True Oriental Secret, the Ansaretic Mystery, the Mysteries of Euless, and the Golden Secret showed readers how they could use their sexuality in combination with a good diet, drugs, devices like magnets and mirrors, mental concentration and study, to exercise their paranormal capacities. I do want to say that this talk was originally scheduled on April 20th, and I was so psyched about that because Randolph was reputedly the first hashish dealer in the United States, and it was really excellent timing. But today is like pretty hallucinogenic as well. So in supplying what he called keys which open doors sealed from man, but which are ready to swing wide when the proper open sesame is spoken by those worthy of admission, these texts promise to transform strangers' reading into a subterranean community of adepts, whose community extended far beyond earthly realms. As Randolph writes in his pamphlet, Guide to Clairvoyance, I have associates. We do not count ourselves as altogether of this world. So Randolph often explicitly addresses his writings about sex to the personal needs of heterosexual married couples, but this address is really at odds with the power he ascribes to sexual activity, as well as the capaciousness of his ideas about gender and sexuality. He wrote, I believe in love all the way through, and while I live will help every man, woman, and the betweenities to win, obtain, intensify, deepen, purify, strengthen, and keep it. And I will help all others to do the same. There, that's me. I mean it. He counted earthly gender identity as, quote, provisional, that is, limited to a given arc of the universal polygon of soul's duration, unquote. And while he believed that the universe was divided into male and female forces, he held that these have no necessary connection to physiological notions of sex difference. He wrote, it don't follow that all who wear the penis are in soul true males, or that a vagina is the sign of womanness. Accordingly, while Randolph taught both what he called feminine and masculine occult practices, those don't correspond to the practitioner's gender identity, but to the types of power they exercise. And God is both male and female on his account. More often than not, he represents marriage as antithetical to love, and love by extension as a subversive activity. Churches and marriage exist as repressions, our system in expansion, he asserts. And then the next line is all in capital letters, love forever against the world. So as this declaration suggests, while Randolph's revelations about sex promise an array of earthly benefits, these included heightened pleasure, physical health, guaranteed love, the empowerment of women, the production of superior children, their real value went beyond the world and even arrayed itself, as he put it, against it. Soul power and sex power are coefficients and codependents, Randolph explained. And thus, by cultivating one's sexual capacities, practitioners could connect to celestial forces and harness their, what he called their power, knowledge, energy, and force. But this can happen, he explained, only at the moment, the very instant of the wholly full, mutual, and pure orgasm, or ejection of the 3 fluids and 2 auras, i.e. prostatic, seminal, and female lympholochia. So mutual orgasm, in other words, opens a momentary pathway to the cosmos, enabling humans to connect with spirits. Thus, while Randolph may have addressed himself to couples, in his account, the best sex always involves more than 2 participants. Moreover, the sexual fluids emitted at this moment of ecstatic extraterrestrial contact had their own use. Dolts and fools may laugh, he explained, but they could be used for, quote, the charging of magic mirrors with the divine, spiritual, reflective powers which characterize them. I'll just leave that image with you for a moment. So with the magic mirror, readers could practice clairvoyance once they've been charged in this way. And clairvoyance would entail, he explained, leaping all the barriers of the outer senses in the world to become en rapport with 1,000 knowledges on earth and beyond it. Each of Randolph's secret societies was short-lived, and we can probably never know how far his underground literature actually traveled. His biographer, John Patrick Devaney, cautions that, quote, the theoretical organization of Randolph's groups always outstripped the actual, and how much was wishful thinking and how much reality is a matter of conjecture. But it's Randolph's wishful thinking about undergrounds that particularly interests me. Evidence suggests he did a lot of it, and I think it is here we can find his fullest accounting of the meaning and possibilities of subterranean life. So he spins out an extraordinary fantasy of a literary underground, for example, in a book called P.B. Randolph, The Learned Pundit and the Man with Two Souls from 1872, which is a kind of like a patchwork memoir that combines a biography and what's supposedly a prison interview, letters and testimonials and newspaper reports. They're all kind of like smushed together in this book. And these materials can frame the story of how 3 men schemed to seize control of one of Randolph's sex magic manuscripts, The Golden Secret, which was one of the ones that was advertised in those excerpts earlier. And they do so by informing the Boston police that Randolph is circulating obscene free love literature. And then the police raid his apartment, and they find his publications, and they arrest him, and they jail him. And then he's arraigned in the 3rd part of the book, which is titled The Great Free Love Trial. And this is like this 30-page kind of judicial spectacular. It involves inexplicably 3 sides. There's Randolph, there's the government, and then there's a representative of free love. And there's also a jury, which is, quote, selected from all the religious sects in the state. And that's, this time it's sects, S-E-C-T-S. And, quote, African, Asiatic, German, English, American, Spanish nationalities. So the trial is obviously fiction. And the story of the men's plot and Randolph's imprisonment seems likely to be so too. But this overheated account of the attempted repression of Randolph's sex magical underground, I think, indicates what he saw as its revolutionary potential. So at the trial, the prosecutor very breathlessly describes the wide reach of Randolph's, quote, alluring doctrines of freedom. In his apartment, police found, quote, vast numbers of letters to him, though Randolph had taken the extraordinary precaution to number these letters and then erase the mailing places, signatures, and dates. And these are from people all over, men and women, married and single, rich and poor, of all lands, tongues, grades of life, custom, color, and religion. And in fact, the prosecutor himself can hardly resist Randolph's philosophy. He's read one of Randolph's books on love and sex, and he admits that, quote, only by the most Herculean efforts of the will was I able to resist its logic or to avoid being utterly swept along by its tide, or swept along its tide by the vast fascination centered in every page and almost every line. Even as he argues his case, he reports something inside continually urging me to speak the words, "Go, Randolph, you are free." As a result of his own experience, he asked the court to, quote, put an enduring injunction on Randolph's works and to totally suppress their future publication. So what makes Randolph what the prosecutor calls the most dangerous man and author on the soil of America, if not the entire globe, is not so much his individual magnetism, but the threat his ideas pose when taken up by unknown, unidentifiable body of associates. Is it safe to tolerate a body of men whose secrets are deeper than the grave, whose ulterior aims are known only to initiates of the third degree, the prosecutor demands? Although, quote, none of us here know these secrets, and those who do are bound not to reveal it, the prosecutor warns that they will inspire men, but especially women, to, quote, undermine the very foundations of a true and conservative social order. And this is a longer quote from Randolph. Fired by the enthusiasm of this weird magician, fascinated by the desire to test their newfound power, they grow restive and restless, until at last, grown sharp, cunning, sure, and fearless, they throw off all restraint, and we are plunged neck deep in the resistless torrent of a social revolution and domestic cataclysm, wherein men must take back seats and universal woman come to the front. So in the prosecutor's fears, Randolph voices his dreams of an occult underground that radicalizes its members by cultivating unsuspected powers in them and connecting their transformed selves to one another and to the cosmos. This experience educates them in an unworldly, otherworldly perspective that diminishes the authority of earthly arrangements, ultimately toppling hierarchies and, again in the prosecutor's words, upheaving the world. I want to take seriously Randolph's desire for an underground capable of world upheaval. And to understand it, I think we have to examine how anti-Blackness increasingly comes to press on Randolph's occult thought. So that his thought is both like so totalizing and so out there that it can seem utterly disconnected from earthly events. But his most prolific writing years, when he's writing the bulk of his occult work, were also a period of intense political activism for him. During this period, he was recruiting Black soldiers for the Union Army. He was helping to found the National Equal Rights League, teaching in and advocating for Freedmen's Bureau schools in Louisiana, participating in various colored conventions, and lecturing and writing in support of these endeavors. John Patrick Devaney, again, Randolph's biographer, describes this work as, quote, almost entirely removed from his usual occult concerns. And other scholars who've written about Randolph have likewise tended to consider his occultism and his political activism as separate tracks in his life. Yet references to racial violence and scenes of Black liberation continually materialize in his occult writing, like its own attendant spirits. These moments invite us to consider the politics of Randolph's occultism, particularly in light of the repeated frustration of his political activism, and to read his dreams of upheaving the world and joining other worlds alongside the unfulfilled promises of emancipation. So consider one especially striking example from After Death or Disembodied Man, which was from 1868. And it's Randolph's fullest account of what he calls the world of disbodied, unearthed peoples. The disbodied, unearthed peoples to which he refers are technically the spirits of the dead in the afterlife, but the adjective's peculiar negative construction, disbodied, unearthed, which implies something done to peoples, and even the word peoples itself, with its connotations of group rather than individual identity, also evoke the situations of Black people in what Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery, an association that's reinforced by references to racial violence that thread through the book. So Randolph wrote After Death while working for the Freedmen's Bureau in Louisiana, where he first taught in New Orleans and then tried to build new schools in the countryside to the west of the city. And while the politics of Randolph's other writing often remain below the surface, he explicitly frames after death's ideas in the context of his work for the Freedmen's Bureau, and especially the experience of being terrorized by white supremacists. So he explains the beginning of After Death, that these circumstances framed his conceptualization of the book. For weeks together, he writes, I was obliged to sleep with pistols in my bed because the assassins were abroad and red-handed murder skulked and hovered around my door. Daily threats of summary strangling seasoned many of my meals while writing out the first edition of this revelation. The offense being that, under the orders of my country's officers, I taught some thousands of Negroes, black and white too, the sublime arts of reading and penmanship. And yet the work was laid out, and yet the work laid out was accomplished then, finished now. Reminders of the book's conditions of production pepper the text, abruptly transporting the reader from the extravagant landscapes of the spirit world to the grim scenes of this one. So at one point he kind of unexpectedly says, I am at the writing of the first edition of this book here in the carpenter shop of Auguste Landry in St. Martinsville, St. Martin's Parish, Louisiana, May 12, 1866. And then like 100 pages later, I am in this barn in St. Martinsville, penning the lines now before the reader's eye. The uncanny conduits between St. Martinsville and the soul realms suggest that Randolph's visions of life beyond the grave may be shaped by his anticipation of his own murder, his elaboration of extraterrestrial spirit realms, in an effort to create a line of flight out of this world. These moments when Randolph's work with the Freedmen's Bureau break through after death might also prompt us to understand his efforts to use his body for what he called intromission into other realms in relation to the quote, double bind of emancipation that Saidiya Hartman names the burdened individuality of freedom. Hartman explains, if the nascent mantle of sovereign individuality conferred rights and entitlements, it also served to obscure the coercion of free labor, the transmutation of bonded labor, the invasive forms of discipline that fashioned individuality, and the regulatory production of blackness. Indeed, Hartman emphasizes that, quote, the regulatory production of blackness is necessary to what she terms the abstract universality that excludes it. For, quote, the denigrated and deprecated, those castigated and saddled by varied corporeal maledictions, are the fleshy substance that enable the universal to achieve its ethereal splendor. But beyond this illusory universality, Randolph pictures an actual universe whose far greater ethereal splendor outshines the earth and puts its arrangements to shame. And instead of locating freedom in what Hartman calls the sovereign individual, he reaches toward a freedom that would lie in collectivity and radical intersubjectivity, whether the preternaturally connected undergrounds he sought to build, or his understanding of one's own person as irreducibly plural, as never actually one's own. In the second half of After Death, Randolph turns from the possibility of exiting this world to the upheaving of it that the prosecutor warns against in the Great Free Love trial. This time, the world upheaval is literal and terrestrial, as well as social. Randolph notes that in his 1863 historical / theological / geological study, Pre-Adamite Man, he had argued that thousands of years ago, the world was rocked by a cataclysm in which, quote, the molten mass in the earth's bowels became disturbed and it vomited forth fire and flame from 100 volcanic mouths. But since he wrote that book, he adds, and this is also to say in the 5 years since the Emancipation Proclamation, I've become convinced that we are liable to such a catastrophe occurring again at any moment. He predicts soon a family of asteroids will strike the Earth, which will cause the northern pole to sink and the southern one to rise, tilting the planet dramatically on its axis. Mountains and mountain ranges will be leveled. A new continent will appear in the South Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. Earth's bowels will be completely outturned, and gold, silver, precious stones, and metals will be thrown to the surface in quantities that will forever bar them as standards of value. Millenarian prophecies were not uncommon in the late 19th century, but after death is distinctive for the way it frames apocalypse with Randolph's experiences of white supremacist violence. These incidents, along with the recent development of Randolph's conviction that we are liable to apocalypse, seem to tie the Earth's imminent upheaval to the continuation of Black unfreedom after emancipation. Notably, the forthcoming cataclysm and the better world it ultimately inaugurates coincides with the literal emergence of the underground. When Randolph concludes the Earth is gestating new and better children, fearful will be her parturition, but joyous will the family be. He imagines the Earth's gestation quite literally as the quickening of forces within it that will forge new communities above it. So I want to end by proposing that we read this vision of the Earth turned inside out as also imaging Randolph's conception of the occult underground, contiguous with the extraterrestrial, against the world. And here I call back to Randolph's account of his racialized identity as the basis for his supernatural powers, in light of Denise Ferreira da Silva's assertion that Blackness knowing and studying announces the end of the world as we know it. Or more precisely, she writes, the end of the world produced by the tools of reason. Because this world and the tools of reason that produce it also produced and are produced by what da Silva calls the category of Blackness, the sorting operations that create a racial subject destined to obliteration, in her words. It is evident why one would fantasize, as Randolph does, about its end. But da Silva also suggests that the category of Blackness, she writes, already carries the necessary tools for dismantling the existing strategies for knowing and opening the way for another figuring of existence, precisely because it constitutes a subject who violates this definition of the subject by being, quote, born into a world it cannot claim as its own. And here, da Silva's words make me think again about Randolph's disbodied, unearthed peoples. Thus, da Silva urges that for, quote, an unknowing and undoing of the world that reaches its core, and to collectively design the framework for reconstruction, here Randolph might want to capitalize the R in reconstruction, we need to follow Blackness as it signals that knowing and doing can be released from a particular kind of thinking, which is necessary for opening up the possibility for a radical departure from a certain kind of world, and instead, quote, opens the world as plenum. Da Silva's analysis allows us to understand Randolph's prophecy of earthly destruction as the logical endpoint of his occultism itself, whose, quote, knowing and doing, released from a particular kind of thinking, might bring about the end of this meager world and discover an unimaginably more bountiful one. Thank you.
Thank you, Lara. Fantastic. Wow. Oof. The floor is open for questions, and you can use the, just a reminder, you can use the raise hand function in the participants menu tab in Zoom if you would like to ask a question. And if you can't see the chat, just before we turn to that, there's a comment about zombies and Haiti in New Orleans and Louisiana, connecting with Delaney as well. So how did he get his work printed and disseminated? Might be that one of the questions I can see there. Good starting point.
I'd be happy to answer that. And actually the relationship to Haiti is really interesting as well, and to New Orleans. So, I mean, New Orleans in the late 19th century, of course, is like a real center for all kinds of kind of African diasporic spiritual practices, and Randolph, and it's hard not to imagine that Randolph wasn't influenced by them. So he talks a bit in his writing about like how he claims that he exposed like a group, a kind of like a secret society of voodoo queens, but then he also kind of like makes a lot of references to voodoo practices and to root work and to obeah, and sometimes says like he kind of uses it to buttress his own knowledge, to say like, well, to kind of authenticate his own knowledge. So he both kind of claims and disavows those traditions. In terms of how he ever got anything printed and disseminated in that time, so a lot of what he got printed and disseminated at the time, he did the way so many other people with unpalatable ideas did, which was that through a job printer. He ran a publishing company with two of his wives kind of successively. And at certain points, they may have actually taken over most of the work of running the publishing companies. And he may have it may have been in his way also of kind of, it's not clear to me, but of ending relationships with them, that they had some sort of kind of financial means to fall back on by having maybe rights to the books. But he also was, and this is really interesting to me, he also was distributed through Sinclair Tousey, who was like a huge distributor at the time and ran the, someone will remember this better than I will, American Book Depository. But he was like a major distributor.
Well, Michael Winship is here somewhere, so he'll know.
Okay, great. So I don't know what this means. And although I suspect, again, that there are people here who would, that Tousey would pick up Randolph's work, would advertise it, as he did in the pages of the New York Tribune. I mean, I do think, and I know Holly Jackson was here at some point, and she's certainly written beautifully about this, that there is a much greater appetite for what would seem to be kind of unpalatable writing or political positions than we kind of might retrospectively assume. Maybe he was part of that. But yeah, I would be grateful to anyone else who could kind of expand that picture.
Yeah, so much to learn about self-publishing, I think, in the 19th century still. Laura has her hand up.
Hi, thanks for this talk. Something I knew absolutely nothing about before your talk. So it's interesting to learn about these sort of more obscure figures of history. But I was wondering, because I know so little both about this time period and about this individual person, if you could talk a little more, and I think this might also feed into what you were saying at the start about how to make this a more material texty talk. I mean, it's just some food for thought for, like, I imagine things you're thinking about, but that I would be more interested to know. But I wondered, I mean, he's writing about all these things, but was there a practical, I mean, especially with his sexual beliefs, it's obvious that he needs not only one other person, but two or more, apparently. I mean, was there kind of an actual little cult group around him? Was there a practice, or was this all in his head and he wished it would all happen? But so I was wondering if there were followers, acolytes apart from these wives who ran the press, who you already mentioned, and if we might have their accounts or ephemera or like pamphlets they distributed in an effort to convert people. Like, was it kind of a, like, let's convert people to the group kind of thing, or was this a, I put my philosophy out there and see what happens kind of thing? And I mean, along those lines, I was also just wondering about the broader cultural context, because I was just thinking of, like, just the array of different kinds of groups that you think of across, they say, the 60s and 70s and the Black Power movement. And there's everything from sort of Malcolm X and Nation of Islam beliefs that became, relatively mainstream long-term, although they weren't when they began, to like very, very out there stuff that was all tied around, the issue of Black empowerment. And so, I mean, you got these kind of cultish groups that grew up, and we're familiar with that from more recent history. Was this, in context, were his beliefs fitting into a similar kind of proliferation of different kinds of spiritual and cultural beliefs, like attempts to create a Black culture in the way that we might think of from the 60s and 70s? Was there kind of a parallel there? And if so, like, are there things, materials or other movements that you could kind of juxtapose his out there belief systems with that would make them make sense within the time period. So.
Yeah, those are really great questions that do kind of like flesh out the scene around him a lot more. So he's in a weird, to tackle the second one first, he's in a kind of weird place because he comes kind of after the 1850s burst of the spiritualist movement, which he is initially part of and then very publicly breaks from. He issues a pamphlet called The Unveiling, or What I Think of Spiritualism, where he castigates the movement and explains that, and it's interesting, he castigates them for any number of reasons, some of which are kind of very kind of particular doctrinal disagreements he has, but he also says that that they're racist, that they used him. So the spiritualists, or that kind of first wave of 1850 spiritualists, are kind of on the wane. But then one of the things that, so I'm not a scholar of religion, but one of the things I've learned from reading about him is that people do consider him very influential for the kind of a next wave of kind of esoteric thought. And so he has a kind of complicated relationship to theosophy. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, where he's influential, but Blavatsky and others kind of like claim that that he was a fraud, and that and also worse than a fraud, that he was like destructive and evil. But they're also drawing a lot of their ideas from him. And then in the early part of the 20th century, he's really taken up by a kind of another wave of Rosicrucianism, who turned to him as a founder. So he helps kind of lay the groundwork for a bunch of other religious movements and spiritual movements that he doesn't get to see the flourishing of. And then as far as the first question, about like the secret societies and the followers, this is so unclear to me. Devaney, his biographer, seems to think that there weren't a lot of people who are actually involved. He does mention some people by name. I've gone and actually tried to like look them up, and some of them seem to have existed and some of them didn't. Like clearly some people were reading his work because of its uptake later. And then after he dies, there are these two women in California who publish a book of kind of insights that they received from him after he's dead, which suggests, again, like some kind of uptake, but it doesn't seem to have been particularly wide.
Yeah. Thanks.
Sure, thanks for that question.
I mean, I would just add quickly that we have, I think we've talked about this, Lara, a collection called the Siebert Collection, and there was a commission in the 1890s at Penn to investigate modern spiritualism, and they appear, from what I can tell, to have collected his works as part of the library. So for what that's worth.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I didn't actually realize that I didn't make that connection. I'm so embarrassed. Even though I looked through the Siebert Commission collection, I didn't realize that the Randolph books that you had were part of that collection.
That's what it looks like, just glancing at the catalog, at least some of them, yeah.
Oh, I should have read the catalog.
We'll poke around one day when we can.
Okay.
And at least one of them, the one after death, says that we have is a 4th edition for what that's worth, so there's some popularity maybe.
Yeah, so he seems to,
unless you just made that up.
It seems like, as many people did, that he made up some of those editions, and some of them, he was very loose about what counted as an edition. Like if he included material in a previous work and then kind of recycled it into a standalone work, then he would say that that was like a second edition.
Let me read a chat remark from Michael Winship and Lynn, who Michael says, I keep hearing echoes of Whitman during this talk, though not in the racialized dimensions, but many similar ideas, and the whole business around Ezra Heywood and the 1881 Leaves of Grass, the the censored poems, Sons of Adam poems in Boston.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
Michael, are you out there? Do you want to add anything?
Yeah.
He's a ghost tonight.
Okay.
Yes, I am tonight. No, I have nothing. I have nothing to add. I'm fascinated in this whole underground and the spiritual. I mean, which of course there was a revival in the 1860s and 70s after the Civil War because of so many people having lost their lives and disappeared with no story. Wonderful work, and I particularly am struck by your tying of it to racial dimensions. But
Great. Okay. Yeah.
And I hadn't actually thought about Whitman, and now, but that seems absolutely true. And Whitman was like, pretty well versed in some of this stuff. So I'd be curious if he actually was familiar with Randolph's work.
I checked. I ran a query on the Whitman archives. Their search engine is not very good, and he didn't come up. But that doesn't mean anything. I mean, he could well have known of his work.
Whoa. Yeah, that's super interesting.
Okay, let's turn next to Marina. Has had her hand up for a while.
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Lara, I love this talk so much. This is so exciting that somebody's writing about Paschal Randolph. And I'm even more excited by the fact that you're connecting his work to Pauline Hopkins' Of One Blood. Where were you when I was trying to write about this in grad school and I just didn't know how to do it? So I would love to hear actually more about that. And also like if you could speak to like what happens in the kind of the geographies that change, right? Because Africa isn't as important, or in some ways is like weirdly ghosted, pun intended, from his kind of world imaginaries that I think are kind of like weirdly like Kabbalistic too, right? So I'm wondering, yeah, like kind of like what happens, and like kind of can you just like flesh out this kind of oblique and ghostly genealogy between Pauline Hopkins, who she's writing about sex magic, right? And then like the ejaculation on the mirror ends up being like water on the mirror, right? So I'm kind of interested in like the watering down of that sex magic, or like I don't know, maybe not watering down, but some kind of other transfiguration of it.
Yeah. So I think so they were neighbors. And I mean, Hopkins was a child at the time, but Randolph had like Rosicrucian rooms that were kind of open to the public in Boston. She knew a lot about occult literature, and Of One Blood, well, yes, as Marina well knows, certainly draws on that material. One of the things that most interests me about the connection between them is that she seems to pick up on like the most Randolph at his most pessimistic, actually. And so what particularly interests me in Of One Blood is like is Tlassar as a subterranean city, or city accessed by subterranean passages, but also one where like that is kind of at an impasse, where it is this kind of like preserved remnant of this like flourishing civilization, but also the end of the book is so bleak in certain ways, like there's just nowhere to go from there. And I'm interested, I didn't talk about it here, but there's a second edition of After Death where Randolph takes out that apocalyptic prophecy, and instead he has this other prophecy, and I don't have it at hand, but Marina, I can email it to you if you're interested, where he's like, and at a certain point, all the Black people in the Americas are going to march off to the Southwest and form their own community. that will be basically where they'll all practice certain kinds of occult magic, and they'll be spiritually gifted, and they'll live there forever, kind of separated from the rest of the world. And it's just like a really weird counterpoint to that kind of upheaval that you see in the earlier edition. And I just feel like this was right at the end of his life, and he just kind of like, his vision of the underground seems to have kind of exhausted itself. Like he couldn't quite believe in it anymore in the way that he did earlier. And so anyway, that's what I think ultimately like Hopkins kind of picks up from him. Yeah, I guess I would love to talk more about that with you, because it's something I'm still trying to kind of work through. And it is also just like something that, I don't know, it's the real bummer part of this, right? Is like the underground turns out to be kind of a dead end, I think, both for him and for Hopkins. Even though elsewhere in their work, there's like much, the underground is a much more kind of like, is a place that's full of much more possibility and energy. But thank you.
Question from Holly Jackson. Please go ahead.
Oh, hey, I don't want to keep us though. Me and Lara can talk some other time. if that's
No, please.
really okay. So once he's showing up in the Liberator occasionally, like I kind of know
Yes.
what his interaction was like with the anti-slavery movement, but I don't know what his interaction was with like actual avowed free lovers. And from what you said, great talk, by the way, really cool, and I learned a lot. And from what you said though, like his dabbling in eugenics, like it's going to make superior babies, his use of cosmology that would like reference Fourier, like it seems to me that he was influenced by that kind of thought. However, you and I have talked about this before, like with the free lovers and the spiritualists, that this raises questions around what is the nature of political engagement versus like a certain kind of disengagement, whether it's through sex or through cosmology or through whatever. That like certainly the trans theory that he's developing there is political. The world-making projects of the free lovers are political, but they weren't movements like the anti-slavery movement was a movement, right? But at the same time, like I think that actually like one contribution that this stands to make is that you are showing that during these periods of like this kind of like, for instance, like millenarian thinking and sex theorizing, et cetera, you're saying that these are also like his years of most significant like actual engagement on the ground. And then I think Hopkins is like an interesting way of thinking through this too, because she's theorizing the occult as a kind of like as a possible sort of jumping off point of Black nationalism. Yeah. And so I think that there's like the clearest way of understanding like white, these kind of like white post-secular forms of like sort of like, oh, they might have some feminist politics, but their spiritualism or their these types of interest in the occult that are ultimately like escapist. I actually think that you seem to be saying that he's offering kind of like an alternative way of understanding those as like engaged in a way that we actually don't understand those white movements as engaged. And so I guess like one, I'm wondering, did he have any overlap with those movements in the way that he did with the anti-slavery movement around the Garrisonians? And two, are you trying to argue that in fact, like this is a more politically engaged version of forms of occultism, spiritualism, millenarianism, that we actually don't, that's like something we don't know about those movements?
Yeah, that's so complicated. And I feel like this is like the question I'm wrestling with, is exactly that. As Holly was saying, he is involved in like the anti-slavery movement. And at least one of the articles in the Liberator is this kind of basically a warning against him, because he would just go to these meetings and essentially troll the speakers. Yeah. And he was considered like really like problematic, and he was like in and out, like you see him, people would comment on him, but he was not, he was disruptive. But which is, I mean, it's really interesting. No, he was a complete pain. Yes, I don't know why like they continued to let him come to these things. But they did. I mean, he's involved for like a period of over 10 years. he accused William Wells Brown of like trying to take money out of a hat. I think, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, but the free love thing, there are not a lot, like I have not found anything that connects him in that kind of in the room way to free love people, or to that movement. He had some kind of weird, like he and Victoria Woodhull knew of each other, but I don't know how closely involved they actually really were. He seems like the whole thing with the free love trial in the Learned Pundit is like he constantly claims he's not involved in free love, but then basically he like in that book he kind of does free love better than the free lovers do it. But anyway, the short answer is I don't know anything solid about his relationship to the movement. I am trying to argue that his idea of a kind of occult underground is like more political, and in fact is not just like more political, but is a kind of critique of those, or contains a critique of the version of the political that those other movements, represented and enacted. He has this like hilarious line where he says I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's like, hold on, let me see if I can find it because it is particularly funny. Oh, he says, there are a great many more radical and other passions in the human soul than Owen, Fourier, Proudhon, and then a bunch of kind of spiritualists and weirdly phrenologists ever thought of or dreamed of. And I kind of want to take him at his word about that. And like, I am interested in how he kind of expands the, what a sense of like what the radical could be. But I don't think he probably realized it. Like I'm interested in him as more of a theorist of the underground than an actual kind of practitioner of the underground. If that kind of addresses your question.
Yeah, no, it does. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Just a quick question that came up in the chat, Lara, that you could clarify. Nicolo asked, did I get it wrong, or was Randolph made a fictional character or some novel? And I think what his question is on this point, right? Because isn't it the Learned Pundit when he's narrating his own trial? Is that?
Oh, actually, you totally could read that as a novel, and he does.
Oh, it's not okay.
A fictional character in it, but I think also I was suggesting that he is the kind of basis for the character of Royal Briggs in Of One Blood.
Ah, right.
By Pauline Hopkins. And I am not the first person to say that. There's Lana Finley, who's I believe a religious studies scholar. I think also made this point like 10 years ago or something in an article on Randolph.
Great. Okay, Devin, go ahead.
Thank you, Lara. This was thank you for introducing this fascinating character, this fascinating person. So since you invited us to sort of think with you, I thought I would just some of the things that came into my mind hearing you.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing was about sort of him creating a sort of subjectivity, which was then put into motion for intersubjectivity. And on the other hand, the other thing was about the sort of sublimation of sexual energies that leads to a certain kind of power and activation, which is very common to this kind of, spiritualist sort of sensibility. And so I'm wondering, putting all these things together, whether the trope of sort of the non-corporeal, sort of disembodied, and I guess that's connected with your anxiety about the materiality of this talk, right? Is linked with another sort of supernormal power that comes from the sublimation, which is invisibility.
Whoa.
And whether he's sort of struggling with the ability to become invisible and be made invisible, which still retains a corporeality with being disembodied. And maybe there's some that kind of intersubjectivity and the idea of the spiritualist and the political that you're kind of negotiating and trying to find in his work. I'm wondering if that's found in his own, if you see that tension in his own work, perhaps playing out.
Wow, that's super interesting. Can you actually can you say a little bit more about the non-corporeal and invisibility? Like, do you mean, are you,
Well,
yeah, sorry.
no, sorry. Well, it's just that you know, in various traditions. I mean, I'm familiar with, but also I've seen it generalized that there's, you know, various ways in which the body kind of can be mobilized, as it were, through this kinds, you know, through these kinds of practices and various things. And so, you know, you can become smaller or bigger, you know, invisible. It can be put into various motions, as well as, I mean, I guess ultimately uh, disembodied, right? This whole idea
Yeah.
of losing corporeality altogether. So I'm just wondering if, because the, you know, the invisibility aspect is a later, I mean, in literature, American literature, and everywhere you see the idea of the linkage between sort of invisibility and marginalization. So, but that retains corporeality. So I'm wondering if
Right.
that's the kind of thing I'm trying to think about, the like those two aspects as part of supernormal powers, you know, that he might be kind of also investigating in his work, but I don't know his work, so that's something which I, you know, you might be able to sense.
That's super interesting. So now I want to kind of reread the work kind of with that connection in mind. So one thing that comes to mind is that he is really, really invested in having a body, like always, even when he is kind of traveling through these other realms. Um, it's just that his body isn't always exclusively his own. And so sometimes he shares it with other spirits. And he then is also adamant that, like, um, unlike earlier ideas where, your body could become a kind of vessel for another spirit that would kind of take over it, that he said that they could kind of commingle there. And so um, so there's like a weird kind of tension between the non-corporeal and the corporeal in his work. And I don't, I'm trying to think about, like, does he become invisible in any of these episodes? And I think he doesn't. But which isn't, but I think that that's like it's interesting that is that doesn't show up, right? Yeah, sorry, I know that's like not a satisfying answer, but it is a really satisfying path for me to get to like go down. So I really appreciate that. And I will be reading these things anew.
And raises some questions about any possible influences that, where's he getting some of his stuff? Where are these threads getting to him? Which is
Yeah.
a hard one to retrace, I'm sure.
And Marina pointed out in the chat, I just saw that Randolph tried to pass sometimes. And he did kind of, so he tried to pass in, like, he would say, like, I'm a mix of 7 or 9 or 12 different types of blood, none of which is African. I think, Marina's suggestion that kind of passing with a mode of invisibility makes sense. But I also think, I think that the description of a different kind of visibility also makes sense. Like, he definitely wanted, and I think Holly's point about him, going and making a spectacle at all of these meetings is to the point here. Like, he definitely didn't want, like, he wanted everyone to notice him. But he wanted them to notice him like on his own terms. And I think probably not for the ways in which they often did notice him. I mean, he spent a lot of his time in these very, very white spaces. And with a lot of people who were terrible to him. And so, but he kind of kept coming back. And I don't know, I guess I feel like if I could kind of figure out why he did that and kind of how he imagined that was he was going to do that, I would be in a better position to answer these questions.
Zach has a question.
Thanks for that great talk. That was really fascinating. And just trying to think more about how it might, relate to the materiality of his books. Thinking about him thinking about the underground and a kind of esoteric figure, the fact that he self-published, he has his own publishing guys. There's a very easy way of thinking like, okay, so he self-published and maybe you would expect a kind of like underground, the analog of kind of underground publishing. And so that's why it was so striking when you mentioned that, no, in fact, like he's picked up by, I forget the name of this major, this major book distribution company. So, and then you think, well, the kind of esoteric theosophy stuff he's doing is not totally underground. It's fairly mainstream in some ways. Like it's very, so I feel like there's more to be done with this kind of dichotomy or false dichotomy between, on the one hand, he has to go to a job in printer and publish this himself. On the other hand, he has this major distribution system that seems interested in distributing. And I don't know if you have any more to say about the kind of, whether it's sort of yo-yoing back and forth or whether there's actually less of a dichotomy there than it might seem.
Yeah, I guess I'm inclined toward the latter because in part because he seems to like work so hard to kind of create this underground, which suggests that he wasn't already kind of in it. So my sense is that his most of his works, he really intended them for a wide audience. Like he probably didn't get that wide audience, but he was writing for it. And so then the underground that he is at least constructing, if not actually, constructing in theory, if not in practice, seems to be kind of carving out a space that he didn't see that he didn't see himself as already occupying and maybe didn't already even exist. And I guess, one question that I'm trying to kind of figure out is how much that underground how much people understood that underground is something that could be made textually during this period, and like how much it kind of seemed to exceed available means of like distribution and circulation and so on.
And are there records, like, do you know of actual particular purchases of his books? Like, do we know when and where some people may have bought them? Like, is any of that available? It would be interesting to know, not how wide his reading was, but sort of if we had any way of knowing where his books could be found, like what, and how widely geographically they were found. And if you had, I assume some number of these copies survive of these books. Like if you could trace their provenance, like probably now they're in institutional holdings, but I don't know if you have any way of figuring out how they got there and therefore who might have owned them in the 1800s, and might be one way to think about sort of what the distribution of these books looked like, and how that might relate to the kind of philosophical undergrounds that he's thinking about.
Like, if I can jump in, I was just looking at our own catalog, and it seems like of the copies we have, most were printed, a couple in Boston, most in Toledo. There's a later group of printings that all seem to be from Toledo.
Yeah, that's where he lived at the end of his life.
Okay, so that's the end of his,
And
but
that's where he was publishing.
some are printed after his death, though, so there's something that continues there.
Yeah, yeah, that's where his so his second wife continued
Okay.
the publication from Toledo after his suicide. And but the interesting challenge would be to find, and I think that's what you were suggesting, that finding the manuscripts and the printed private letters and so on. And almost none of those exist. So there are two of them are reproduced in that biography that I mentioned. And I think those are in private collections. But it would be, I'm wondering, yeah, it would be interesting to, like, you know, to write to the people who hold them and to see if at least there was, like, is there a signature on them, and so on. You know, the Learned Pundit, which is the book that contains the account of the obscenity trial, claims to have all these letters from the people who read the manuscripts. You know, I've like done some amateur, mostly just like Googling of these people. And these is, I think I mentioned, some of them did actually exist. Some of them didn't. But he claims, of course, that like he's sending these to all corners of the world. I don't know. I mean, I think he probably wasn't, but I also think that like a few of them got out. Like he certainly sprinkles enough references to them and kind of advertises them enough in his other work that, and that was distributed well enough that I can't help but think that like some people would have been curious enough to write away for it.
Jordan.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, thank you. Always, it's a pleasure to think with you. This is a history of sexuality question, but it relates to a couple of the others, Zach's and Holly's, and a couple that have been asked. It strikes me that Randolph's texts are unusual objects in the 19th century, right? Which is to say that they're a theory of how to have sex.
Yes.
And so folks who do history of sexuality work are usually looking at like vice raids and police records, or they're looking at debates about birth control, which is a medical information that gets sexualized, right? So this kind of, I don't know nearly as much about the 1870s as you do, I'm earlier, but it seems that this is just a really unusual kind of text. And if that's true, the fact that he's producing it as a secret that he's then exposing seems to add a really weird and interesting, like you don't have to, if you have a unique object, you don't have to do that that people will recognize its uniqueness, right? You don't have to say it was a secret that was there. So I don't know if this is an epistemological aspect of his text, or I'm just really interested in, it seems like he's really kind of walking the long way around the block to get where he's going. And I'm wondering if that's something that you have an account of, or you could talk about.
Yeah, totally. I think that, I mean, not totally, I have an account of it, but I think that's interesting. And I'm curious about it myself. And yeah, I think like, it's all so excessive, right? All of the secrecy around it. Because like, yes, right. You give people instructions for how to like connect with extraterrestrial beings through having sex. And like people like aren't going to need to be told that this is like surprising information or like new information, right? So I do think that like part of the that in a way that like he is less creating an underground through which to transmit like an account of how to have sex than he is creating an account of how to have sex in order to create an underground. And that like, I mean, which isn't to say that like he wasn't invested in how to have sex with the spirit world, or with like your partner in the spirit worlds altogether, but that like and that's why I do think that that the connection that he imagines there between like you and your partner are having mutual orgasm, you're in the mutual orgasm, you're also connecting to aliens, but also in doing so, you're like in this community with other people who are also having mutual orgasms with like extraterrestrials. Like there are all these kinds of like layers and layers and layers of connection that are happening here. And I think that's what he seems to be most after, is how those could be, like how those could radiate outwards and help build one another. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It also just seems, I mean, I think that I understand what I misunderstood, but it also still seems to me that, and this isn't a critique of your argument, it's a critique of him, but it just seems to me that there are other ways. If you want to get people on board, there's easier ways, right? And the elaborateness, the kind of weirdly elaborate account of producing a community, which, you know, by your research didn't actually totally exist. Something's happening, and anyway, I'm fascinated by it. So thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that could be said for so much about his life. Like there are so many easier ways of doing things, but like, I mean, this is kind of the world building, right? Is also the kind of the excessively complicated nature of it. All of the rules and all of the are kind of, I think, in the service of that world building.
Thank you, Jordan. I don't see any other hands at the moment, although we have another minute or two if someone wants to ask a last question. I'm going to just tack a little differently just for fun, Lara, and ask you something I've always puzzled about. I think it's time that someone needs to write a history of the exclamation point in the 19th century. And I was just looking at his titles, you know, and love at last, soul, seership. There's some weird one called New Mola, whatever the hell that is. Okay, so I'm being silly, but I mean, it is, I don't know what, I guess, is that sort of advertising culture of the era or theatrical culture of the era that's kind of, you know, there's exclamation points everywhere. And I don't know, I just think it's a weird additional piece of stuff there about whatever.
Yeah, and I think that actually relates to Jordan's question about like how, you know, what is that exclamation point producing? And I think it's producing the newness that doesn't require the exclamation point to be, or the producing the weirdness or the surprisingness that doesn't need that exclamation point to exist. But he's like so, he's just like going so over the top about it all. And I think he also had an expectation that a lot of people were going to see those titles but not read the books. And he was interested in that, right? Like that was part of the underground, was that like not everyone could enter. And so a lot of his books, you know, like a lot of like our 19th century books, contain at the end a list of other titles, and his are often broken down in quite explicit detail in terms of like what the contents of each section is. And, you know, I think part of that is, and so you get all of those exclamation points on display, right? And I think part of that is like letting you in, and I think part of that is keeping you out. And just saying like, you know, you're not going to see this, but like if you did, imagine how your mind would be blown.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. Well, my mind is blown, at least, and I think everyone else's is too. So we'll stop here and put on our cloaks of invisibility. And thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, both for having me and for all of these like super interesting and productive comments and questions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody, and whatever plane of existence we are now or will soon be on, we hope we'll see you all soon, and take care and be well. And thanks again, Lara.
Thank you.